I have driven the Kor'veth Reach transit lane for 19 years, and in that time I have moved iron ore, freeze-sealed grain panels, medical cryopacks, engine housings, livestock manifests, and once, just the once, a shipment of ceremonial stonework so heavy it bent my rear axle. Plates on the Velshan halt ramp. I do not carry passengers. I do not stop for more than 4 hours at any waystation, because 4 hours is all my manifest allows, and I have never once asked for an extension. I eat from a thermal pouch, I sleep in the bunk behind my cab, and I file my delivery receipts within 30 minutes of every offload. I am, by any measurable account, a man who does exactly what the job requires and not one thing more. I want to be clear about that before I say anything else. I want you to understand what kind of man I was before all of this, so you understand what I mean when I say it changed something. Not in a way I can easily name. But it changed. The container was manifest number 44 on a run of 62, logged as a cargo transfer from source station to a breeder's consignment depot in Velshan's lower dock tier. 44 was flagged on my scanner before I even finished parking, amber for damage. The freight agent at Velshan Halt was a young woman named Karis, maybe 22, with a tablet she held like a weapon, and the flat voice of someone who has processed too many damaged pallets to care about any one of them. Specifically, she met me on the ramp, already pulling up the damage report. Container 44, she said, without looking up. Impact fracture on the climate shell, probably happened in transit through the Kor'veth corridor jump. Internal temperature dropped to 4 degrees for approximately 9 hours. The consignee's been notified. She swiped the screen. Consignee says log it dead and dispose. They're not accepting damaged live cargo. What kind of live cargo? I asked. She swiped again. Hatchling batch, dragon stock, 6 in the manifest. A pause. 5 are confirmed dead. There's one that's showing faint biosigns, but the consignee said, "Show me the container." Karis looked up for the first time. She had the expression people get when they're deciding whether to explain that this isn't how it works. Then she looked at me more carefully, 61 years old, 19 years of the Kor'veth Lane, a face that has had that particular argument more times than she has been alive, and decided not to bother. She showed me the container. It was a standard insulated hatchbox, about the size of a cargo pallet, and the climate shell on the left face had been cracked clean through by a shift in the load behind it. When Karis keyed it open, the cold came out first. A breath of stale, freezing air, sharp with the smell of dragon stock, something between iron filings and warm stone, with a note of something older and more animal underneath. The 5 were dead. I won't describe them. They were very small. They were stacked at the near end of the container in the kind of huddled formation that suggests the cold came slowly enough that they moved toward each other first. The 6th was at the back. It was not dead. It was alive in the way that something can be alive when alive is the only thing it has left to be. Not thriving, not moving, barely registering. It was curled tight against the rear wall of the container, the small knobs of its folded wings pressed flat against its back, its ridge spine pulled in as much as it could pull in. Its pale-scaled body, white pale, not a common color in dragonstock, almost crystalline looking in the container's failing light, trembling in a constant shallow shiver that didn't look like it had much left in it. It was no bigger than my forearm. Its eyes were closed. Albino, Karis said, behind me. That's why if it was in a special climate container to begin with, they don't hold heat well. The consignee said even if it survived the cold drop, an albino this young usually. She stopped. I was already reaching in. I have large hands. I have driven freight for 19 years, and before that I worked loading bays. And before that I grew up on a frontier doing work that required large hands and not much gentleness. I am not a man who holds things carefully as a default, but I held that creature carefully because when I got my hands around it, one under its folded wings and one under its hindquarters, tilting it up out of the container, I could feel how light it was and how little warmth it had, and how the trembling ran through its whole body like something that had been running for a very long time and was about to stop. "What are you doing?" Karis asked. "Taking it," I said. A pause. The consignee logged it dead. I straightened up. The creature was against my chest, still shivering, eyes still closed. A dead thing can't be refused on delivery. I'm not delivering anything. Karis stared at me. "I'll need the damage report stamped," I said. "Manifest 44, climate failure, 5 confirmed losses, 1 biological unit unrecoverable for delivery purposes. That language work for you?" She stared at me for another few seconds. She was calculating something, not the legality, because I suspected the legality was murkier than either of us wanted to examine in the next 4 hours. But something else. Something about whether this was a problem she was going to have to write 2 reports about instead of 1. "I'll stamp it," she said. unrecoverable for delivery. Thank you, I said. I carried it back to the cab. The heat in a long-haul freight cab runs from a panel behind the driver's seat, and the warmest place in the whole cab is the narrow shelf above the bunk, where the heat duct runs closest to the surface. I had a thermal blanket I used for cold stop nights, one of the heavy ones, silver on the inside, and I folded it double on the shelf and laid the creature in the center of it and wrapped the sides up around it without pressing, just to contain the warmth. Then I sat in the driver's seat and watched it for 20 minutes while Karis's team finished my remaining offload. It kept shivering. The shiver did not stop, but it did not get worse. When she knocked on my cab door to tell me the offload was complete, I didn't move for a moment. I was watching the creature's rib cage. I could see it through the thin, pale scales. The ridge of ribs not much wider than my finger, move in shallow, rapid little rises. "You're good to go," Karis said through the window. "Right," I said. "Thank you." I pulled out of Velshon Halt 47 minutes after I'd arrived. 3 minutes over my manifest window. It was the first time in 11 years I had left a waystation late. I want to be honest about what I thought at the time, which is that I thought it would probably die in the first night. Albino hatchling dragon stock that had spent 9 hours at 4 degrees. I am not a vet. I have never worked with dragon physiology in any professional capacity, but I have transported enough live cargo manifests to know that faint biosigns is the kind of language that means the signs are there because they still counting down to 0, not because anything is coming back. I took it because I couldn't leave it in that container. That was the whole of it. Not because I expected anything to happen. But it didn't die in the first night. By the time I hit the Kor'veth transit corridor 8 hours into the run, the shivering had slowed, not stopped. It was still there, a low persistent tremor in the creature's body, but slower, and the pale scales had taken on a faint warmth of their own. I checked it at my first driving rest, reaching up to the bunk shelf and putting my hand near enough to feel the heat coming off it without disturbing the blanket. Warm. Not warm the way a healthy thing is warm. Warm the way something is warm when it has decided, for whatever reason, to keep going a little longer. I ate my ration that night and did not think about what I was doing. I drove the next segment of the route, filed my check-in beacon at the Kor'veth midpoint, and slept for 4 hours in the bunk below the shelf. The creature made no sound during the night, but once, when I was drifting between the first sleep and the second, I felt a small movement through the bunk frame, a shift, a repositioning, the tiny mechanical rearrangement of something that was moving itself, rather than being moved by a tremor. It was a small thing. It meant nothing particular in the immediate sense. I lay there in the dark for a while after, listening to the transit corridor hum through the hull, and thought about that. On the second day, I had a problem. The problem was that by the second day, the creature was clearly alive in a way it had not been on the first day, and alive things need to eat. I am not carrying live cargo provisions. I am a single-driver freight cab, not a livestock transport, and I had no idea what an albino hatchling dragon stock consumed at this stage of its development. I knew what adult dragon stock ate because I had transported it. Protein concentrate cakes with mineral supplement, the smell of which is enough to put you off your own lunch. I did not have protein concentrate cakes. I had 6 days of standard human thermal rations and a small dry goods supply kept in the compartment behind the seat. I stopped at the first rest halt on the Kor'veth corridor and sat in the cab for a while thinking about this. Then I went through my rations and found the ones with the highest protein content. They were a dense, pressed grain and legume brick, about the size of 2 fingers, that I had always found reasonably tolerable, but not something I would call a pleasure. I broke one in half and then broke the half into pieces smaller than my thumbnail and put them on the edge of the bunk shelf and sat back in the driver's seat and waited. Nothing happened for about 10 minutes. Then the corner of the thermal blanket shifted. The head came out first, narrow and ridge bone, pale as river ice, with the angular jaw characteristic of the larger dragon breeds, even this small, and 2 yellow eyes that had been closed for everything I had seen of this creature and were now open. The eyes caught the light differently than I expected. There was a depth to them, a particular quality, as if the yellow was not one shade of yellow but several stacked behind each other, going back further than the size of the eyes should allow. It looked at the pieces of grain brick. It looked at me. It looked at the grain brick again. Then it put its head down and ate 3 pieces with the focused, single-minded precision of something that has no spare attention to give to anything else while eating. I watched it for a while. "All right," I said to nobody, and turned back to my controls. By the 3rd day, I knew its weight, not because I had weighed it, but because I had carried it. You learn weight by repetition. Every time I shifted it from the shelf to check underneath it, every time I moved the blanket, I was cataloging information without meaning to. It was light, too light for its frame still, but less light than it had been. It was taking on substance in the small, concentrated way that things do when they are very young, and the body is throwing everything it has at the business of survival. It had begun to make sounds, not sounds I expected. I had transported enough dragon stock to know the hatchling distress call, a high, piercing whistle, alarming enough that I had once pulled over the freight cab thinking something in my engine had cracked. This was not that. This was a low, intermittent sound, somewhere between a rasp and a hum, that the creature made with no particular urgency or pattern. It made the sound when it was on the shelf. It made the sound when I transferred it to my lap on the single occasion I did that, during a long straight segment of the corridor when I could drive with one hand and hold something with the other. It made the sound when I put it back. I did not know what the sound meant. I know now, or I think I know. At the time, I only knew that it was not a distress call, and that it continued regardless of whether anything was happening, and that on the fourth evening, when I was sitting in the driver's seat, eating half of a ration bar, and it was on the shelf behind my shoulder, the sound and the eating of the ration bar seemed to happen together in a comfortable silence that I had not had in the cab for a long time. I have driven this route alone for 19 years. I am not a man who describes himself as lonely. I am a man who drives alone, which is different, and I had never thought there was any particular problem with it. The work was the work. The cab was the cab. The route was the route. But there is a difference, I was beginning to understand, between driving alone and driving with something else alive in the space behind your shoulder. I did not think too much about this on the fourth day. I noted it, the way I note a change in corridor traffic or a variance in my fuel consumption, and I drove on. On the fifth day, I gave it half of my heat blanket. This was practical. The blanket was large enough to fold double, which gave the creature full insulation from underneath, but it wasn't large enough to fold double and still cover me when the night temperature in the transit corridor dropped to the level it dropped to at the Kor'veth deep point, which was enough to make sleeping in the bunk uncomfortable without insulation. I had been taking the blanket from the shelf and using it for my own sleep and then putting it back when I got up, and on the fifth night I noticed that after I had put it back and the creature had settled in it, it had pulled one edge of the blanket over itself in a way that suggested it was using the covering deliberately rather than just lying inside a shape. I sat and watched this for a moment. Then I went through the storage compartment and found my secondary cold weather layer, a dense quilted jacket I wore for outdoor offloads in the winter corridor stops, and I spread it over myself in the bunk instead, and I left the thermal blanket on the shelf. I slept better than I had in a while. I don't know that the two things are connected. On the sixth day, I named it. I didn't mean to. It happened the way these things do, which is that you say something and then you have said it, and it is no longer something you can unsay. I was transferring it from the shelf to check the wound on its left foreleg. It had sustained a small laceration in the container, from the fracture probably, and I had been cleaning it with the medical wipes from my first aid kit, and it was still for the examination in the particular way it was always still for the examination, not because it was afraid to move, but because it seemed to understand that the process was not hostile and that stillness made it faster. Good, Vel, I said, not thinking. I put it back on the shelf. I sat with that for a moment, Vel. Short for nothing, or short for the Vel Shan Halt where I'd found it, which seemed as reasonable a reason to name a creature as any. The creature didn't respond to it or acknowledge it or give any sign of having registered that I had said anything. But I had said it, and that was that. On the seventh day, the sound changed. The low rasp hum had been consistent since the second or third day, varying slightly in rhythm but not in character. On the seventh day, halfway through my morning drive window, the sound change register dropped slightly, broadened slightly, became something I can only describe as more intentional. Not louder, exactly. More directed. The creature was on the shelf, and the sound was pointed at the back of my head with a specificity that it had not had before. I drove for a while. I know, I said finally. It wasn't a response to anything I could have translated. I just said it. The sound continued. I know, I said again. It didn't stop, but it settled. Smoothed out into the lower register, less pointed, more ambient. The way a sound can settle when something has been acknowledged, even if the acknowledgement isn't precise. I drove the next 6 hours with that sound behind me, and at some point during the second hour, I stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing the corridor hum and the engine vibration, not because it faded, but because it became part of the background of things that were simply there, the ordinary texture of the cab. This is the thing I find hardest to explain to people who weren't there, which is everyone. I was not changed dramatically. I was not struck by some revelation. I was a 61-year-old freight driver, eating half rations and sleeping under a quilted jacket on a corridor run I had done 512 times. And there was a small, pale creature behind my shoulder that ate pressed grain brick from my fingers and made a sound like something old and stone, deep, and none of it was dramatic. None of it was the kind of thing you'd tell a story about. But I had been empty for a long time, and I had not known I was empty. And now there was a sound behind my shoulder, and something alive on the shelf above my bunk. And the cab was not the same cab it had been before Velshon halt. I drove, I kept Vel alive, that is what I did. For 3 weeks and 2 days, across the second half of the Kor'veth Reach lane and back into the mid-corridor transit stops and out again to the Velshon delivery terminus, I kept that creature alive. I am not going to pretend it was elegant. I had to ration my own food seriously by the second week, a creature that is growing uses more than it did the week before, and I had not provisioned for a passenger. I was eating 1.5 ration portions a day by the end, stretching the dry stores and supplementing with the corridor stop canteens where I could afford it. I was cold at night because I had given the better insulation to the shelf. The laceration on the foreleg healed cleanly enough, but there was a secondary inflammation that I addressed with the last of my antibiotic strips and some improvised compress work that I am certain a vet would have looked at sideways. Vel grew. Not quickly, it was still small by the end of the 3 weeks. Still light in the way that albino dragon stock tends to run, with the fine bone structure and the pale scales and the ridge spine that would eventually be impressive and was currently just visible above the blanket edge. But it grew. The too light, barely their weight of the first day resolved by the 3rd week into something more like the weight of a thing that was actually here and intended to stay. It ate more. It moved more, began using the full length of the shelf rather than the back corner, began tracking my movements around the cab with those layered yellow eyes, began appearing at the edge of the shelf and looking down when I was in the bunk, with the particular expression that I had come to read as generalized inquiry. It flew once, very briefly. On the 15th day, when I was at a corridor rest halt with the cab door propped open for ventilation, it launched off the shelf and crossed the interior of the cab in 3 wing beats, clumsy and magnificent in the confined space, the pale wings catching the light from the door in a way that made me stop what I was doing and simply look. It landed badly on the passenger seat, gripped the headrest with both sets of foreclaws, and regarded me with an expression I had no vocabulary for. "Don't do that in the corridor," I said. "You'll hit something." It looked at me for another moment. Then it climbed back up to the shelf. I filed my corridor check-in beacon 2 minutes late that day because I had forgotten to hit it. The first time in 6 years I had missed a check-in window. I should say something here about what I was not doing, which is asking whether any of this was wise. I am a man who asks whether things are wise as a rule. I ask before I take an alternate corridor route instead of my filed heading. I ask before I spend money on anything beyond manifest requirements. I ask before I accept any freight contract that varies in any way from the standard terms I have been running under since I was 42 years old. Caution is not a virtue I was taught. It is a habit I built, in the way that people who have had certain kinds of difficulty build habits. You put a structure around yourself, and you move inside the structure, and the structure works, and you don't examine it too closely, because examining it might reveal that the structure is what's keeping you upright and you'd rather not know. I was not asking whether keeping this creature was wise. The question did not occur to me in the normal way that questions occur to me. I was feeding it and warming it, and driving my route, noting in my log that container 44 had been destroyed per manifest protocol, and the rest of it was happening in a part of myself that the structure did not cover. The nights were the hardest part. Not because they were cold. I have slept cold on this route before and I know how to sleep cold, but because by the 2nd week the creature had begun sleeping at the edge of the shelf rather than the center, and in the dark of the bunk I could reach up and feel the small warmth of it there, without having to move much. The first time I did that, I told myself I was checking on it. The second time, I told myself the same thing. By the 5th or 6th time, I had stopped explaining it to myself and just did it. Reached up in the dark, felt the warmth and the slow rise and fall of a sleeping creature's ribs, confirmed it was still there, and went back to sleep. There is a ward in a hospital, or there was when I was a child in the place I grew up, which was not a place anyone from outside it would have recognized as somewhere to grow up, where people went when they were not going to get better, but also were not going to get worse any faster with care. My mother worked in that ward for 11 years, and she would come home at the end of each shift with the particular expression of someone who has been giving away warmth all day, which is not emptiness exactly, but a kind of productive tiredness, a tiredness that knows where it came from and is not unhappy about it. I had not thought about my mother in a long time. On the 12th night, lying in the bunk with my hand up on the shelf in the dark and Vel warm and quiet under my palm, I thought about her for the first time in maybe a decade. Not a specific memory, just the quality of presence. The way she was in a room, the particular combination of practicality and attention that made her the person she was, that made the ward run the way it ran, that made the people in the ward feel, for whatever time they were there, that they were not simply being maintained but genuinely attended to. I had not understood until recently that those were different things. Vel shifted under my hand, a slow sleeping rearrangement, tucking one wing in closer, and made the low rasp hum once without waking, the way creatures make sounds in sleep when something in the dream is comfortable. I lay in the bunk for a while after that, in the hum of the corridor transit, and thought about what it means to be in a place and also to be attended to, and whether those things are the same for every kind of creature or only for some. Then I slept. By the 16th day, Vel had stopped needing me to handle the laceration on his foreleg. The skin had closed and the scaling was coming in over it, pale as the rest of him, fine-textured. The new scales slightly smaller than the surrounding ones, and brighter, the way new things are brighter before they weather in. He would occasionally investigate it himself, touching the site with the tip of a foreclaw in the precise, methodical way that dragons seem to touch things they are attending to, and then he would leave it alone and do something else. I had started leaving the antibiotic strips out of the kit, just in case, but he didn't need them anymore. By the 18th day, he had also started bringing me things. This is harder to explain than most of the rest of it, and I include it because it is accurate even though I know how it sounds. He would find objects in the cab, loose bolts from the maintenance kit, one of the small wrench adapters from the tool roll, twice a piece hardtack from the dry store that he had somehow extracted without my noticing, and he would carry them to the edge of the shelf and drop them in my lap or on the bunk beside me with the particular expression that I had learned to read as neither random nor entirely purposeful but something between, the way behavior is between random and purposeful, when it is very old behavior that the creature doing it does not have full conscious access to yet. I put the bolts back in the kit. I ate the hardtack. The wrench adapter I kept in my breast pocket for a while, which is not something I can explain, and eventually put back in the tool roll. He watched me do all of this with those layered yellow eyes. He watched the way that young creatures watch things, not passively but cataloging, the continuous low-level work of building a world from the data available. The scanner anomaly appeared on the 18th day. I would not have noticed it if I had not been running the extended range sweep at the Kor'veth Deep Corridor crossing, something I do not normally bother with, because the Deep Corridor segment is the emptiest stretch of the Kor'veth Lane, 80,000 kilometers of cleared transit space with almost no traffic and nothing on any registry worth scanning for. I was doing it because I had the scanner open for unrelated reasons, recalibrating after a minor corridor drift, and when I broadened the sweep to confirm the recalibration was accurate, there it was, a beacon signal, very low power. The frequency was not in my manifest database. I pulled it up and cross-referenced it against the public registry and found nothing. Then I pulled it against the secondary registry, the one that logs frequencies for non-standard transponders, research vessels, diplomatic convoys, old design craft, and it came back with a single entry. Velshar Fleet frequency, registered 312 years ago, inactive, flagged as extinct. I sat with that for a moment. I did not know what Velshar was. I want to be honest about that. I had driven the Kor'veth Reach lane for 19 years and the name Velshar meant nothing to me, no more than any of the dozen dynasty names and fleet designations and bloodline registry codes that appear in the corner of a manifest and get filed and forgotten. I had no reason to know what it meant. I noted the signal in my log, flagged it for corridor control as a potential legacy beacon anomaly, which is the standard protocol. Continued my run. The signal moved with me. Not closely. It stayed at the edge of the extended scanner range. Far enough that it was easy to tell myself it was coincidence, that it was simply maintaining the same corridor heading I was. But over this next 2 days, as I completed the Kor'veth leg and began the final run to the Velshan delivery terminus, the signal maintained a consistent bearing relative to my position. Not following, exactly, pacing. I thought about the signal more than I would like to admit during those 2 days. I had been in the Kor'veth lane for 19 years without once being paced by a vessel that was not on my manifest. This was, by any ordinary measure, anomalous. The obvious question, what did the signal want? Who was the vessel? What was the connection between a 300-year dead beacon frequency and a damaged live cargo container from a breeder's consignment depot was a question I kept picking up and putting down without answering. Because there was only one answer that fit all three pieces, and the answer was sitting on my shelf, eating the last of the pressed grain brick with the focused single-mindedness of a creature that had no interest in the complexities of its own situation. On the 19th day, I pulled the Velshar frequency up again and looked at it more carefully. The secondary registry entry was sparse: name, frequency code, date of registration, and a status line that said Velshar Bloodline Fleet. Active registry suspended. Line recorded crystallized, standard year 3041. A bloodline record notation attached, which I had to request a clearance to open, and which came back 3 hours later with a single paragraph. The Velshar were one of the oldest dragon bloodlines in the Kor'veth Reach. Their line had produced 7 matriarchs over a span of 800 years, and their fleet had maintained the deep corridor routes at the edge of the Reach before the modern waystation network existed. The line had crystallized. The registry used that word, crystallized, meaning concluded, closed, preserved in the record but no longer active, when their last breeding pair had failed to produce a viable hatchling cycle. The fleet had disbanded. The bloodline record had been sealed, crystallized, something that had been living and moving, petrified into the past tense, preserved there, unchanging because nothing was going to change it. I looked at the shelf. Vel was asleep. His ridged spine was relaxed, his wings folded flat. The pale scales caught the ambient running lights of the cab in a way that made him look, in the half-dark of the sleeping hour, like something carved from the same material as old stone and corridor frost. Not cold, but permanent-looking. The kind of thing that has been somewhere long enough to belong to it. I turned back to the forward screen and drove for a while without thinking about anything specific. Then I thought the egg cycle had been preserved somewhere for 300 years, and then discovered, and then transferred in a damaged container to a breeder's consignment depot that had logged it dead before it arrived. And now a beacon that should have been silent for 3 centuries was pacing my freight run at the edge of extended scanner range. Quiet, consistent, not approaching. Waiting. I did not tell Vel about this. I am aware that is a peculiar thing to say. It is a hatchling. It does not receive information verbally. It does not require updates on scanner anomalies. But in the 3 weeks we had been sharing the cab, I had developed certain habits of the voice. I said things, not to receive responses, just to have said them in a space that now had something else alive in it. I did not mention the beacon, I don't know why. Something in the shape of it felt like something I wasn't ready to say. On the 22nd day, I came around the inner corridor approach to Vel, Shan Terminus, and saw the fleet. I want to describe this carefully, because I think it is important to be accurate about what it looked like and what I felt. Velshan Terminus is a standard transit freight way station, functional, mid-tier, unremarkable. I have delivered there 47 times. The docking approach is a standard corridor approach, a 2-lane freight lane with approach beacons at standard intervals, and the exterior docking tier has berths for up to 24 freight units and a passenger terminal on the upper level. It is not, in any sense, a place that has ever given me a reason to slow down before I reached my berth assignment. I slowed down. There were ships at Velshan Terminus that had never been at Velshan Terminus before. They were not freight vessels, and they were not passenger vessels, and they were not, as far as I could tell from my initial scan, registered in any current fleet registry. They were large, larger than anything that should have been able to dock at a mid-tier freightway station, and yet they were docked, or moored close enough to dock that the distinction wasn't functional. They were dark-hulled, with a surface texture that caught the ambient corridor light and did something complex with it, something that made them hard to look at directly for more than a moment, as if the surface was designed to resist casual attention. There were 9 of them. My proximity scanner pinged the docking control at Velshan Terminus. Standard approach confirmation, routine. But the voice was not Velshan Terminus docking control. Freight Unit Kordrakar 77, this is Velshar Fleet Commander Arath, speaking from the Matriarch's forward vessel. Please confirm you are carrying Manifest Unit 44 from Velshan Halt. Date of pickup 17 standard days ago. I stared at the communicator panel for a long moment. 18 days ago, I said. Confirmed. A pause. Longer than a communication delay would account for. Freight Unit, what is the current status of the live cargo? I looked at the shelf. Vel was sitting at the forward edge of it. Not lying, sitting, 4 claws on the shelf edge, head up, ridge spine raised slightly in the way it raised when something in the environment had shifted. The yellow eyes were forward, toward the communicator panel, toward the corridor ahead where the dark ships were visible through my forward screen. Alive, I said. Healthy. healing a minor laceration, eating well. Another pause. When the voice came back, it was different. Not different in tone, still controlled, still formal, but different in the way that a controlled voice is different when the control is working harder than it was a moment before. Please proceed to berth 1, Fleet Commander Arath said. You will be met on the dock. I was met on the dock by 11 of them. I had seen dragonkind before, of course. You cannot drive the Kor'veth Reach lane for 19 years without encountering the species in various capacities: dock workers, freight handlers, passengers, officials. I had carried dragonstock manifests, as I said. I knew the proportions, the scale, the particular quality of presence. What I had not seen before was 11 of them on a freight dock in close formation. Still, scaled in the deep gray black of old stone with the banded gold brown of their underscale catching the dock lighting, each of them large enough that the dock itself looked smaller than I had ever seen it look. Their wings were folded. Their eyes were forward. They were not threatening. There was no threat in their posture. And the distinction between the posture of something that is about to be dangerous and the posture of something that is simply what it is and has chosen not to be dangerous is one that 19 years on the Kor'veth lane teaches you to read. They were simply present, immensely, weightily, unmistakably present. In the center of the formation, slightly forward of the others, was one that was larger than the rest and older. I could read the age in the scale texture, the particular deep weathering that only comes with real time, the weight of presence that is not the same as size. She was watching the cab door with an expression I had no vocabulary for, but that I recognized in the way you recognize things that are more ancient than your vocabulary. I opened the cab door. I had Vel in my hands. I had picked it up from the shelf. The first time in several days that I had felt the need to be holding it rather than simply having it nearby. And it was in my hands the way it had been on the first day, one hand under its folded wings and one under its hind quarters, except that now the folded wings were larger and the weight was the weight of something that had grown. I stepped down from the cab onto the dock. The 11 were still. Vel was still too. Not the stillness of cold, not the stillness of sleep, but something I had not seen in it before. A high stillness. A stillness that was reaching out towards something. The old one in the center, the matriarch, I understood, though no one had told me yet, looked at Vel for a long moment. Then she looked at me. Her eyes were the same layered yellow I had been seeing across the shelf of my bunk for 3 weeks, except ancient in a way that Vel's were ancient and waiting, depth behind depth. She looked at Vel again. Then she made a sound. I have tried to describe this sound to the 2 people I have told this story to, and I have not managed it either time, and I am not going to manage it now. It was low, it was from the chest, and from something behind the chest, something that had more space in it than the space available. It rolled through the dock and into the dock's walls and back, and it was nothing like the sound Vel made in the cab, and it was exactly like the sound Vel made in the cab. Vel answered it. Not the same sound in a smaller, higher register, a sound that had the same resonance in embryo, the same quality, unmistakably the same language. It came out of Vel the way something comes out of a creature when the thing it has been calling for in the dark has finally answered. I stood on the dock with my hands full of a pale creature I had kept alive on pressed grain brick and bad medical tape, and I watched the old one come forward, and I did not move. She stopped in front of me. Her head was nearly level with mine, which tells you something about her size relative to everything else. She looked at Vel in my hands. Then she looked at me with those layered eyes for a moment that I could not have timed. She said something in the fleet language, the Velshar fleet tongue, which I do not speak and had not heard before that day. Fleet Commander Arath translated from behind her, his voice flat and careful. She asks how long. 22 days, I said. Translation. Response. She asks what it was when you found it. Alive, I said, but not by much. Translation. Response. She asks what you gave it. I thought about this. Food, I said. A place to be. The translation was longer than the answer had been. I don't know what Arath added or omitted. When the matriarch responded, she spoke for longer than she had spoken before, and when she stopped, the dock was very quiet. Arath said, the matriarch tells you that this is Velshar Kor'veth Van. He is the last of the Velshar hatchling line. The line has been recorded as crystallized, concluded, for 311 years. A preserved egg cycle from the line's last breeding was discovered 14 months ago and transferred for incubation. He is the result, the only result. A pause. The consignment was intended to deliver him to the Velshar fleet here, at Velshan Terminus, which carries the name of the bloodline. The damage to the container was unknown to the fleet. I looked at the creature in my hands. The small, pale face, the ridged spine, the folded wings slightly larger than they had been this time last week. The yellow eyes that were looking at the old one in front of us with an expression that was beyond anything I had words for. He was logged dead, I said. Yes, Arath said. We know. I looked the matriarch. He's not, I said. No, Arath said. He is not. The matriarch spoke again. Arath translated. She asked your name. Fendracher, I said, translation. She asked what role you hold. Freight driver, I said, long haul. Kor'veth Reach lane, 19 years. Arath translated. There was a sound from the 11 around the matriarch, not speech, more like something that passes through a group when something has landed that they were all holding their breath for. The matriarch spoke, and her voice had a different quality than it had had before, still measured, but deeper, the way something gets deeper when it has been holding weight for a long time and has finally carefully set it down. Arath said, the matriarch names you Kethvan. In the Velshar record, it means a pause that I think was him looking for a translation that would carry the weight. The vessel in which the line did not end. I did not know what to say to that. I did not say anything. The matriarch extended one foreleg, slowly, deliberately, with the careful ceremony of something that does not move casually, and touched the side of Vel's head with the tip of one claw. The claw was the length of my forearm. The touch was lighter than breath. Vel made the sound, the low, humming rasp, the sound I had heard across the shelf of my bunk on 100 dark stretches of the Kor'veth lane. The matriarch answered it, the same sound in the ancient register. And something moved through the formation of the 11 behind her, a ripple, a settling, the physical collective exhale of something that has been tensed for a very long time. Then she looked at me and looked at Vel, and she was waiting. I understood. I held Vel for another moment. I am not going to dress this up with language that makes it larger than it was, because it was already large enough, and the things that are already large enough do not need dressing. I held it, and it was warm in my hands, and the yellow eyes were still forward toward the matriarch, toward whatever was there that I could not perceive, and then I held it out, slowly. And the matriarch took him, with both forepaws, one under the wings and one underneath, the same way I had held him for 22 days. She held him against her chest, in the hollow of her sternum where the scales are finer, and the warmth runs closer to the surface. And Velshar Kor'veth Van, last of a crystallized line 300 years gone, made a sound that I will carry until I don't carry anything anymore. They stood there on the dock with the 9 dark-hulled ships behind them in the corridor light, and I stood in front of them with my empty hands, and none of us moved for a while. Then Arath was beside me, and he said quietly, there is a record being kept. The matriarch has asked that your name be in it permanently, the circumstances of the finding, the care, the delivery. She has asked that Velshan Terminus carry a notation in the Velshar registry of what occurred here. I just drove my route, I said. Arath looked at me. He was a younger dragon, not old as she was old, with the gray-banded scale of the fleet line and eyes that were more amber than yellow. He looked at me with those eyes for a moment, as if I had said something he recognized. I know, he said. That is what the notation will say. I stayed at the terminus for another 2 hours, because my manifest required it for the drop-off of my remaining freight. While Karis's counterpart at Velshan processed my delivery confirmation, the Velshar fleet prepared to depart, and I did not watch from the dock. I watched from the cab, from behind the forward screen, because I had paperwork to do, and the paperwork was not going to do itself. But before Arath had returned to the forward vessel, he had turned back to the cab one more time. He will know, he said, when he is old enough to know things, when the line has had time to breathe. Again, he will be told the name of the vessel in which he survived. He will be told Fendracher, Kor'veth Reach lane. I looked at him through the window glass. He probably won't remember me, I said. Arath considered this. The Velshar line has a long memory, he said. 311 years long, as it turns out. He went back to the ships. I watched the 9 dark hulls move away from Velshan Terminus in a slow, deliberate departure that was not like the departure of freight vessels or passenger vessels or anything else I had seen depart a waystation in 19 years. They moved the way things move when they have the weight of continuity behind them. Not fast, not ceremonial, just purposeful. The corridors of space are large, and they moved into them and were gone. The dock was a freight dock again. Karis's counterpart handed me my delivery confirmation. I filed my receipts. I climbed back into the cab. The shelf above the bunk was empty. The thermal blanket was still there, folded loosely from where I had moved it that morning. My quilted jacket was in a heap on the bunk underneath. There was a small impression in the blanket from the weight that had been there, and the blanket still held a faint warmth from it, though that would be gone in an hour. I sat in the driver's seat for a while. I was cold, the way you are cold when you haven't eaten enough for 3 weeks, and you've been sleeping under a jacket instead of your good blanket. I was tired, The way you are tired at 61 on a long haul run after the adrenaline of something large has passed. My cab was clean and quiet, and everything was where I had left it before Velshon Halt 22 days ago, minus 4 days of rations and the last of my antibiotic strips. There was a bolt on the passenger seat. One of the ones from the maintenance kit. He had brought it to me on the 14th day, and I had put it back in the kit, and apparently he had retrieved it again at some point without my noticing. I sat and looked at it for a moment. Then I picked it up and turned it over in my hand. It was an ordinary bolt, 12mm hex head, stainless, slightly scratched from being transported around the cab by a dragon. Worth approximately nothing. I put it in my breast pocket. The communicator pinged. My next manifest confirmation from the corridor control at Kor'veth Junction. The return leg, Velshon Terminus to Kor'veth to Source Station, standard freight run, standard cargo manifest, nothing flagged for damage, nothing live. I pulled up the manifest. I sat with it for a moment. Then I reached to the shelf and I refolded the thermal blanket, properly folded, the way I fold it when I'm using it for myself, and I put it in the bunk where it belonged. I put my quilted jacket in the overhead storage where it belonged. I cleared the small residue from the shelf where the dry store crumbs had accumulated across 3 weeks of feeding. I put the first aid kit back in its bracket. I straightened everything. Then I started the engine. The corridor stretched ahead through the forward screen. 80,000 kilometers of the Kor'veth Reach deep segment. The quiet and the dark of transit space, the approach beacons blinking at their intervals. I knew every beacon. I knew the distance between each one and the next. I had timed this corridor so many times that the timing was in my hands rather than my head. I pulled out of the berth. The cab was quiet in the way that cabs are quiet when they have been quiet a long time, and you know it. But I had been right about the difference. I knew the difference now between driving alone and having driven with something alive behind your shoulder. The difference is not in the sound of the engine or the feel of the controls or the texture of the route. The difference is in what you know about yourself when you get back to the silence. I drove. I had a route to finish. I had receipts to file, beacons to hit, a manifest of 61 remaining units to deliver across the back half of the Kor'veth lane. I was 3.5 weeks behind the pace I had planned at the start of this run. I was short on rations, and my antibiotic strips were gone. I ate the last of the pressed grain brick I had in the dry goods store, just the last of it, because there was no reason to save it now. And I drove the first segment of the return leg, and I filed my check-in beacon at the Kor'veth midpoint exactly on time, and I did not miss it. I did not think, as I drove, about the record being kept. I did not think about the name in the registry, or the 9 ships moving through the corridor, or the matriarch's foreleg extended with that impossible delicacy toward the creature in my hands. I thought about those things later, in the weeks after, when I was home for the standard inter-run leave, and had time to sit with things that had happened without the forward screen, filling my vision. What I thought about, driving the Kor'veth segment, was that an albino hatchling I had kept alive on pressed grain brick and rough field medicine and a folded thermal blanket had turned out to be 300 years of something that the universe had decided was finished, and then had decided was not. The universe does that sometimes, it seems. Decides a thing is finished, records it as concluded, moves on. And then a container gets damaged in transit through a corridor jump, and a temperature drops for 9 hours, and a freight driver pulls over at an amber flag on the manifest. And a thing that was supposed to be finished is not finished. I am not a philosophical man. I have been told this, and I believe it is accurate. I do not draw large conclusions from specific events. But I drove the return leg of the Kor'veth Reach lane that afternoon with something in the cab that I could not have put on a manifest or logged in a delivery receipt, a quality of weight that was not the same as emptiness that had not been there before Velshon Halt. The route was the same route. The corridor beacons were the same beacons, blinking their patient intervals. I was, it turned out, not quite the same driver. I stopped at the first rest halt in the deep segment and bought a full meal from the canteen, the first proper hot meal I had bought in 3 weeks, because my ration budget had been going to someone else. I ate it in the cab with the door propped open and did not rush it. The corridor was quiet in the way the deep segment is always quiet. No traffic, no radio, just the ambient hum of transit space at the edge of the reach. I reached into my breast pocket and took out the bolt. I set it on the shelf. Then I finished my meal, closed the cab door, checked my manifest, and drove. I checked my next manifest at the Kor'veth Junction. Standard freight, nothing live 60 units, all readings nominal. I noted the fuel stop at corridor point 7, the rest halt at corridor point 12, the offload window at Source Station East Dock. Then I put the manifest down and looked at the shelf. The blanket was folded. The shelf held one 12mm hex bolt. I looked at it for a moment, just looked. Then I pulled out of the Kor'veth junction and set my heading for corridor point 7 and drove.